Welcome guests, poets, lovers of the magic of words. My name is Mbonisi Zikalizomkonto, and I'm a board member of the Literary Arts Windsor, as well as a poet and storyteller. It is an honor to welcome you here to Bookfest, Festival du Louvre, Windsor, whose theme is Bridging Communities. Before we get started with today's program and all our programs in the festival, it is important to share this land acknowledgement. Literary Arts Windsor acknowledges that our organization and the festival are based on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nation, which includes the Ojibwe, Odawa, and the Potawatomi. We respect the long-standing relationships with First Nations people in this place in the 100-mile Windsor, Essex Peninsula and the Straits. We are so proud to have continued to bring this wonderful annual festival of literary arts to Windsor, Essex County, without interruption for over 22 years. We are together again online to share a literary festival that presents an amazing and diverse group of authors. Our charitable organization, Literary Arts Windsor, particularly wants to recognize especially Canadian heritage, the University of Windsor, and the Essex County Library for helping to make these events possible. I'll be moderating this event on the theme Borders and Belonging. And with us on the panel this morning are three poets. Jules Delorme is a neurodivergent Kanya Kehaka or Mohawk author of Kanyan Kehaka and French heritage, who grew up on the Akwesasne Reserve near Cornwall, Ontario. When Delorme was 12, his abusive parents moved the family to Toronto, where he continued to suffer bullying and violence at home and at school. He's also the author of Fola and Ashiaton, You Should Write It, a collection of stories based on Kanye Kehaka oral traditions and teachings. I Heard a Crow Before I Was Born is Delorme's third book. He lives in Toronto. Linzey Corridon is a mixed race, Afro-Euro-Indo-Caribbean educator and a Vincentian Canadian poet and critic. He is the 2021 recipient of Canada's Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship and is currently completing doctoral work on the nuances of the Queer-Ribian Queuetodian at McMaster University. His writing has been published in The Puritan, Cola, SX Salon, Hamilton Arts and Letters, Montreal Writes, and more. He lives in Hamilton, Ontario. Being featured at Bookfest Windsor is his new book of poetry, West of West Indian. And lastly, we have Daniel Maluka, who is a Toronto-based artist and writer hailing from South Africa. His work takes an Afrocentric approach while incorporating surrealist elements to bring what lurks in the deep recesses of the mind into the forefront of his work. His new book of poetry being featured at Bookfest Windsor is Unwashed. So I'll start with a question that I will pose to the three of you with regard to your separate work. So since the theme of this conversation is borders of belonging, how do you each define belonging, and how do borders, whether physical, cultural, or personal, impact that sense of belonging in your work? Jules?
Um, well, I literally grew up on the border between Canada and the US.
Mm.
So I don't think I think I don't like the idea of borders at all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, you know, this is, I think, that, you know, the idea that borders are created, something that human beings have created,
Mm-hmm.
this line that we've created between each other is, you know, is also the way we've created conflict. This,
Mhm.
that, this is the line that you cannot cross. Um, um, that, I belong to this, you do, I belong to this group, you belong to this group,
Mhm.
you know, that it that's where we create problems,
Mhm.
you know. I I
And
think
what's
if there weren't such a thing as borders, I
Mhm.
think there wouldn't be problems.
Oh, okay. Okay. And what do you think, Lindsay?
I I heard two questions, so I think I will respond to the first of those questions, which was how do I define belonging in relation to borders? And I do agree with Jules that I think the concept, the idea of a border is fabricated. It's this weird balance in between recognizing that it is a fabrication, it
Mm-hmm.
is something that exists, but also is brought into existence through imagination, through material like constructions. And so, like, I'm very much interested in thinking about the ways in which, as a human being, as a queer person, as a Caribbean person, how I can exist and persist in a world beyond the current fabrications of this world. And a part of the current fabrications of this world is this idea, the concept of the border, which persists and is sort of responsible for a lot of the violence that we're navigating as societies in the global north, but also in the global south. So I think that's my first response. And
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of how this idea of belonging or borders impacts the work, in particular, this first book is I ended up trying to articulate a location, a geopolitical, a material, but also a psychic location, somewhere in between where I'm from, which is the Caribbean archipelago, and where I'm at now, which is Canada, the global north. And I think for me, I ended up finding that place of belonging somewhere in between those two sites, which isn't a real place. If anything, it's a psychic place at best, but it's still a place that when I write this work, when I read this work, when it resonates with those who can identify with it, that place in between the Caribbean and Canada is made real. It's a place where borders don't exist, they don't persist.
Mm-hmm. And Daniel?
Yeah, I would say that I agree with the rest of the panel on how borders are artificial and they're not necessarily a good thing. Borders, it's like one of the byproducts of becoming agricultural, becoming settlers, property, land ownership. Borders are kind of like in line with all of those things. So in terms of how borders relate to my own work,
Mm-hmm.
there is one poem in my collection, Unwashed, that sort of speaks to the immigrant experience
Mm-hmm.
and how various individuals sort of like moving into it's about here in Canada, here in Toronto specifically, and how
Mm-hmm.
individuals have moved to this new place. So they've crossed borders to come here for new opportunities, and kind of how inherent in that immigrant experience, inherent in that sort of border crossing, there's kind of like a sleight of hand that the
Mm-hmm.
that the that the place that you're coming to is doing, right? It's like come here, you'll have a better life, you have a better opportunity, and then once you arrive, it's typically not all it's cracked up to be, right? A lot of places are thought to be places, lands of milk and honey, but the reality of those places are different. So I would say that's how borders sort of relate to my work. But
Mm-hmm.
just personally with borders and belonging, how I interpret that, um, it's been very interesting. So I was born in Eswatini, used to be called Swaziland. I just say South Africa because once you start talking about Swaziland, people say, "What, Switzerland?" And once you start talking about Eswatini, people are like, "What? What's that?" Because they changed the name, right? So something that I wrote recently that's not in the book was about how my mother, when she's back home, when she's in Eswatini. She has to cross the border into South Africa to visit some of the graves of my ancestors. And that, I think, really encapsulates the artificiality and the meaninglessness of borders, because those borders were put there by colonial powers. They had no understanding of which land is where, why these people are here versus somewhere else. So I would say that I can relate to that idea of belonging and, feeling like, I'm sure that, anyone who's from somewhere else or has ancestry somewhere else can relate to the idea of like being from one place but not living there, but living in another place and not necessarily feeling like you belong there 100%. So
And just to begin with you, and then Beck, I'll ask two questions each now regarding your work. So how does the theme of alienation in your work interact with your identity as the child of, South African immigrants growing up in Toronto? And where do you feel like you fit in, and where do you feel excluded?
yeah, that is a good question. So alienation is a theme that always appeared in my writing. Um, I think something about big cities, they're they're sort of prone to giving that sense of alienation. And it's like further underlined by not being born there. It's further underlined by being a minority there. So I would say that like at times I do feel like I belong in Toronto, because in growing up, it was quite diverse. We had the area that I grew up in, we had kids from literally like all parts of the world, right? So I did feel like I belong in some instances, and then other instances you're like quickly reminded, right, that hey, this is not really your place, right? You're here, but it's not really your place. There was something I wrote recently, a poem called Maximum Africa. It's newer, so it's not in the book, but it's touching on that idea of, okay, like in my household, whenever my parents would talk about home, I knew they didn't mean the place in Toronto we lived. So this idea of home being a place that's further away from you, that you're connected to, you can call people from there, but it's still distant from you. So I would say there was always this feeling of being like belonging and not belonging, being at home and not being at home, sort of. So yeah, I would say that's how it's been in terms of the immigrant experience. But what was the other part of your question?
Mm. Well, I'll just ask another question just to Linzey, then I'll come back to that when I look at some of your specific poems. So to Linzey, you say your work explores the concept of queer Caribbean identity. So how do you define the borders between queerness and Caribbean identity in your poetry? And do these facets of identity collide, converge, or coexist?
I thank you for the question. I'm not sure I actually think of the concept of queer and the concept of the Caribbean as separate entities. Simply on a fundamental level, I try to think of queerness, or a lot of my work around queerness, both the creative and the critical, starts from that 16th century understanding of the word queer, which is a troubling sort of disturbance, not quite sitting right in society. And for me, Caribbean people embody that to a T. Like the existence and persistence of the region is wrapped up in a very sort of troubling history. And out of that troubling history, out of slavery, out of exploitation comes people who are constantly troubled because of those histories, because of that legacy. And so they are fundamentally queer as they exist today. That would be my argument. Um, yeah, no, that would be my response. I don't think of the idea of queerness and the Caribbean as separate, which is why I sort of run with the term Caribbean. It's a way to sort of honor both of those like troubling histories, but also not wanting to lose that sort of sexual connotation of that word queer that we often attribute to the word queer.
Mhm. And as someone who writes about restructuring heteronormative orderings of experience, how does your poetry challenge societal borders that have historically excluded or misrepresented queer individuals, especially in Caribbean contexts?
Mhm. I think, excuse me, I think the immediate thought I'm having is the ways in which the collection plays with language. In particular, I sort of double down, I lean into a lot of the derogatory language that has come to define queer peoples from the Caribbean archipelago, that continue to define or haunt Caribbean peoples, queer Caribbean peoples in diaspora. Like a lot of the collection, the first few pages, you will come across words like bulaman, batiman, antiman, chichiman, those types of words that when people hear those words, you oftentimes flinch because you've been conditioned to respond to those words in a negative way or to have a negative reaction. I think this book in particular is challenging not only people from the Caribbean, but challenging human beings in general to maybe reconsider the way you are conditioned to be in relation to language and think about the ways in which a group who has been traditionally or formally bogged down by such words, the conditions associated with these words, like maybe recondition yourselves to allow them to, one, reclaim those words and to deploy them as they see fit and to be okay with that. So I think language is the immediate question and response I have for you.
Great point. And Jules, your work focuses more on generational trauma, and you see the build up and the many situations with the many characters that you introduce in your memoirs. So how do you feel like the legacies of colonization and cultural loss form those invisible borders that limit or complicate belonging for indigenous communities?
Hmm. Well, it not just for indigenous communities, for all, you know, for everybody that's been colonized, it, you know, it creates a feeling that your home is not your home. And you grow up with this sense of, the theme that I keep repeating is that you don't know your identity has been taken away. You don't know who you are. You don't know what you belong to. And that is the greatest crime that has been committed. And it is very hard to, it is, the thing that, is constantly, you, you constantly is really hard to communicate because you hear again and again is the people who are who have not experienced it says, well, why can't you just get over it? Well, it is because it happened a long time ago. It is not that simple. It is just you have grown up in a you know something that was done to my grandfather. My grandfather did to my father did to me, and all of that has been passed on like ripples in a pond. And I didn't even see the rock being dropped in the pond, but it touched me. It affected me. And, I don't even know why the rock was dropped. I don't even know why, you know, it happened. I wasn't there. but I know that it hurt me. And, I don't know why my father didn't love me. I don't know why my father behaved the way he did. I don't know why my father, I don't know, and I'm still trying to explore that. I'm still trying to explore why my father was the way he was. I'm still trying, and my father, obviously, didn't know why my grandfather was the way he was. And that is all, and it isn't just indigenous, it is just anyone who's colonized, you know, all over the world.
And you do mention in the title piece, about how Jack distanced himself from his Mohawk identity and attempted to pass off as French. So how does this tension between erasing and reclaiming indigenous identity resonate with your own journey? And how do you navigate the border between what is hidden from you and what you have reclaimed in terms of your cultural belonging?
It is very, it's very difficult because it has to do with language. In that, my father, Jack, my blood father, Jack, he did not speak the language at all. And I grew up just knowing a few words. My grandmother, on the other hand, spoke the language, but the language has changed, and so, I can speak a few words, but, that language is part of my identity. And my blood father Jack, he spoke, he would not, my mother, who was French, forbade me to speak French at home because French were the low class citizens. My father, who was Garageha, Mohawk, forbade me to speak Mohawk. So I was forbidden to speak either language. So I could neither be French or Mohawk. And, so I had no identity. I had, no cultural identity. And it wasn't until, later adulthood that I started to, try and go back and try and explore that identity. And now as a writer, I'm trying to, find that identity. And, when I do, do things like go to powwows and I start to hear that language, I suddenly feel like inside of me, come alive. Just hearing the words, hearing the voices, that, these are my people.
And that's interesting. Speaking about that, as it brings me to this idea of what was mentioned in Daniel's piece of the shrinking, where you start to feel invisible. So I just wanted to ask Daniel, like in that poem, amongst many, that sense of diminishing presence. How does the poem explore the immigrant experience of feeling reduced or invisible in a new society? And do you see this shrinking more internal, external, or both?
Okay. So that poem, The Shrinking, it was inspired by Metamorphosis by Kafka. That was on my to-read list for a long time. Finally read it, and masterpiece for a reason, right? So when I was writing that poem, The Shrinking, that was one of the things that sort of, I wasn't aware of that, of like that shrinking being representative of being an outsider. But once it was completed, it's there. It's obvious. I think it goes to show how much is sort of unconscious at times when we're writing. But that aspect that you mentioned of the diminishing presence and how I took it like literally in that poem where the individual, shrinks down and is falling off their bed sheets and is then in the street or whatever. That is how it can feel like at times when you're a stranger in a strange land, when you're, in a new place and you don't know anyone. I used to work with this nonprofit where we helped youth, people up to the age of 30, help them find work. A lot of them were newcomers, and so many things sort of you don't really think of, like you take for granted when you lived here for a while. Things like, okay, this individual doesn't have the funds to buy transit to get to the place. This individual doesn't have data to help them locate how to get to an interview. And sort of putting yourself in those people's shoes and feeling how small that must make you feel. And, you're with new types of people, a new language maybe, all of those things that are sort of like unrecognizable to you. So I think that the poem does touch on that, and that sort of like diminishing presence of being shrunk. It's it is one of the things that's typically in my mind when I am writing. And if that feeling is internal or external, I think, it can be both, right? There can be people who try to make you feel small for whatever reason that is, right? And it can also be an internal thing. Unfortunately, you can internalize those feelings and kind of like position yourself and reorient your mind in that sort of way. I think one of the most healing things, I think, that we can do as immigrants, as people of color, is to go back home. If you're lucky enough to know where your home is, go back to the place where you're not being forced to shrink. Go back to the place where you can be your most exuberant, your most you self, right? Go back to the place where there's more people like you walking down the street and you don't have to perform a way of being when you're in public. I think that's one of the main ways to help alleviate that internal shrinking feeling.
And Lindsey, so there's the poem Passing Light, where there was this powerful juxtaposition between the patrilineal fire and the nurturing influences of the women in your family. So how do these contrasting forces shape your sense of belonging within your cultural and familial heritage?
I think there's definitely a contrast, and it's a severe one in the sense that my patrilineal side of the family is predominantly European. My dad is British, and so I come from a line of European migrants to the Caribbean region who moved there specifically to exploit it, to exploit the islands, to exploit its peoples. And my mother's side of the family is Indo-Caribbean, so she comes from a long line of indentured Indian peoples to the region from Trinidad up to St. Vincent. And so I'm a product of both the peoples who were exploited and the people who moved to the region to exploit those peoples and the land. And so it is this constant trying to come to terms with the reality that I'm a product of such, and I don't even have the language to this day. I'm the product of such a mixing, I will say mixing of these two worldviews, two ways of being in the world, two sets of tensions, political, social, cultural. And so I'm constantly trying to navigate what it means to honor that patrilineal fire, to recognize that it is a part of me, while also keeping space, holding space for those matrilineal histories that have shaped me in ways that I'm grateful for, right? It is this constant battle to understand that while there are problems wrapped up in these histories, while there are violences that emerge out of these histories crossing with each other, that I'm still very much here and I'm still very much a part of this world and trying to make light of it, trying to change it, trying to make something different within it and of it.
Mhm. And so you say in that same poem, you know, as this declaration that I am no ordinary man, you know, and challenging traditional gender norms and expectations. Can you explain? Can you speak about how concepts of gender fluidity and nonconformity inform your journey in reimagining borders of belonging for queer Caribbean peoples?
I'm not sure I can speak to that question of gender fluidity per se. I will speak more to the idea of sexual fluidity, which is something that I sort of think a lot with in my academic work. I'm about to defend my PhD, and sort of I wrote a dissertation on sort of, the idea is Caribbean people and the region as fundamentally sexually fluid. Like there's a space in which I think, based on the behaviors of my people, you can make an argument that we are actually not bound to this sexual binary that we have been conditioned to accept and perpetuate. If anything, our behaviors demonstrate something otherwise. And so Mm, I think this idea of sexual fluidity then makes it difficult for us to belong in the ways in which we are taught to belong. So we are expected to be straight or gay. We are expected to be black and white. We're expected to occupy a position on the binary. But this idea of sexual fluidity that I'm proposing in the Caribbean sort of like perspective is one that forces us to move outside of that binary and therefore troubles this fundamental understanding of belonging that we all hold. Well, not that we all hold, but is the predominant way of thinking about being in the world, this sort of binaristic thinking. I'm sort of just chucking that out the window and asking us to start from somewhere else, something fluid.
Mhm. Mhm. And now I would love to have you read your material. I'll start with Jules. If you may please read us an excerpt from one of your entries in amongst the memoirs.
Oh, Jesus, I didn't bring. Can you give me a sec? Can you go to someone else and I'll grab the book?
Okay, that sounds good. Daniel?
Yep. So I could just pick any which one to read, yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I think because it was mentioned, I think I might as well read The Shrinking. So, okay, so The Shrinking. Taking the road well traveled, I am taken. My worn out soul's crying out in pain from slamming concrete. Cosmic traveler moves beyond and well outside of myself. Shrunken down, thrown in the oasis of blankets, swimming through sweat, sliding down the blanket down to the floor, using my hands and feet to break my fall. Through the gaps between my bedroom door and the floor, I ran. Through the cracks of apartments, from unit to unit, household to household, seeing the lives of so many, seeing that no one is unique, hearing their arguments illuminated through the pale light of screens. Watch world, watch us, watch ourselves. Street level and shrunken, made to shrink at the enormity of concrete, blocks, glass buildings, scratching the sky's back, mountains of tires, barely escaping their rubber avalanche, roar of the outside, blaring horns, dodging sudden death, feet overhead, palms over ears, no shelter from the noise storm. The only reprieve was below, down in the depths deeper, into the gaps of sewer grates, the churn of noise muffled, now but the falling, deeper, into the cavern, underneath, the world of the city falling, downward into that shaft, 85 million liters of wet. Further down I fell. Here was a freedom in the falling, better to fall.
Beautiful. And you speak of that freedom in the falling. Like, how does the tension between, shrinking and finding freedom then play into the broader themes of belonging? Do you see a form of acceptance or resilience emerging from the fall itself?
Yeah, I think that the fall can be interpreted as just like kind of not caring how you land, and by that meaning like not caring how you're received.
Mhm.
Just sort of embracing who you are, flaws, accents, good English, bad English, no English, whatever. Accepting who you are as you are and embracing however that comes off to anyone externally. And then being free because you're not being contorted or bent into a shape based on how you're received. So it's sort of like the idea of kind of like embracing the cringe, or like the idea of like being the most authentic self that you can be, flaws and all, I think, is sort of how I interpret that.
That's a great interpretation. And Lindsay?
Would Jules like to go next? I don't want to impose.
Maybe Shape of Love. I do love the way that
Hey,
poem speaks about the unlearning. That beat is just so beautifully written.
I'm happy to read that one. Let me just find it very quickly. My voice is clear?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so this is The Shape of Love. Where I come from, the sea caresses fresh waters. It summons passageways, symbiosis, collecting our ugliest regrets and storing them. An endless record of the living, a constant reminder of the dead, the promise of togetherness through all eternity. This is a story both old and new.
Mm.
They say we are troubled, unnecessary problems. I say to you, we are love, autarky, and the violent. Where I come from, funny men self-select, free to self-immolate, a rum bottle in one hand, fractured desire in the other. How easily misanthropes slip into old ways, into belief that we can see stars, even though many of us are ablaze, the pages of our lives lit up, anti-men, now biblically secular. It is always the powerful, charged with recording melodies, who right us wrong. I'm arranging a perpetual song, one sustained by fortissimo bridges, and refrains syncretizing belief. You see, I'm unlearning cycles, rhythms of silences and remembering how to speak, how to smile, how to frown, how to be proud with the twist in my hips, the glow of my skin in the shadows, how the pressure of my voice echoes into centuries past because of these words, the miracle of becoming embodied flesh and power. I'm unlearning love of the ugliest kind, swapping stones and blades for empathy, escaping the fire and brimstone into the sea. I ebb and flow like the morning tide, caressing the shore, the land of my birth, sopping the hands and feet of my persecutors, leaving them pruned, making space in their funny toes and fingers for love. I am unlearning how to teach the broken about the damaged. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful poem. And as part of that need to unlearn cycles and swap stones and blades for empathy, how does unlearning contribute to finding that sense of belonging, especially in a context where cultural and personal histories are marked by trauma? Like, how do you see this process of unlearning and healing, reshaping the concept of love within queer Caribbean communities?
I think with this first book in particular, I would say that a large part of it was learning to be honest with myself and asking others around me, others in my community, to hold space for that honesty to exist, to persist, to circulate. And I think if we lead with honesty, like no matter how brutal those histories are, no matter how visceral our responses to those brutal histories are, I think we are inching closer towards a space in which we can begin that work of unlearning. I think a large part of the work starts from a place of honesty. Like that uncertainty is inevitable, but in starting from that place of honesty, in giving yourself the chance to share, but also to listen to other people's truths, you help each other work towards a space in which we might create something different, right? Like, I think that's where I started with this book, and I hope that's where it ended up to as well.
That's powerful. That's powerful. Jules, you ready now?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I heard a I heard a crow before I was born. I heard Chokawe before I was born. It was dark and wet and warm in a way that I will never know again. And I heard a crow call out, a lone Chokawe. And even then I knew that the loneliest sound on earth is a crow calling out, and there being no answer. That crows are among the most social birds, and Chokawe, being alone, is a tragedy that echoes her nature and beyond. Chokawe is a trickster in Ganagaha, in Mohawk culture. The people of Jack, the man who called himself my father, but I would never call father, but most importantly, my Doda and my grandmother and her beliefs, because it was she that mattered most. Not because it matters in Ganagaha, in law, the female, not the male line, and female, not the male clan, but because it was she who gave me the reason to stay alive when my life was the deepest, darkest, and bloodiest, and it seemed there was nothing to live for, and no one, neither of my parents, no one else in my family wanted me, but she, my Doda, treasured me and taught me the old Ganagaha ways and told me stories and told me of the tricksters, Chakawe and Nigogwagataha, Coyote, and Tenetakaha, rabbit. Those tricksters are always up to no good. And whenever I heard a Chakawe, I knew that if she was not calling to her mate, she was laughing, and very likely laughing at me. I have always been fond of Chakawe and her laughter and her tricks. But there is a call that Chakawe makes when Chakawe makes a cry to her mate, a cry out to another crow that just breaks my heart. Whatever reason, Jack's violence towards my mother escalated when she was pregnant with me. I don't know if she beat me, if he beat her when she was pregnant with my older sister Debbie. He probably did. But he got really violent with her when she was pregnant with me. At one point, he dragged her down the stairs by her hair and stomped up and down on her belly. I learned about this later in letters when she wrote, and then from my stepfather and my real father, Dalton, the only man I called father, Dalton, the white man who stayed and tried to love my mother's children, even though we made ourselves so hard to love. But I knew before then about the beating when I was in my mother's womb because I felt it.
You mentioned the violence of that was meted upon your mother while pregnant with you, and how it seems you were aware of this before being born. So how does this pre-birth experience of violence shape your understanding of borders, like between life and death, acceptance and rejection? How does this early trauma intersect with your cultural and familial identity?
Well, I think I think, what I was trying to, I think, the reason I started the book off that way was that I entered the world that, but, it isn't just that my father, was that my father had been violent towards my mother while she was pregnant with me, and therefore was violent to me before I was even born, but that it was generational, that, that people, that the violence was being passed down for generations, for upon generations, that I had been born with this generational um, violence.
Mhm.
But that it was, sorry, it
Oh,
was
no, no,
just,
no, 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 no,
it,
no. Continue, please. Continue.
it was just a matter of learning, when I get to the end of the book, it's a matter of learning to live with that. So it's a matter of learning to live with the fact that, you know, that, that this colonial violence is, is a fact,
Mhm.
that, it is there. It is a fact. And, you know, it is a historical fact, and it happened. We can't make it go away.
Mhm. Mhm. And then, like, lastly, to each one of you, so what do you hope that readers, particularly those who may feel alienated or on the margins, what do you hope they take away from your explorations of belonging? Well, what can they take away from reading your expressions of belonging and the borders in here therein, starting with Daniel?
Yeah, it's a good question of what readers can take away. I guess sort of the one thing that's coming to mind is not letting your sense of self be dictated by the society that you're in,
Mhm.
that there are sort of like release valves that you can use to sort of escape that like overwhelming pressure um, of society making you feel as though you don't belong. I think that like the book itself is like one of those artifacts. Because for me, writing and artwork as well, those were the two main things, even to this day, that I used when I was younger to sort of create my own space where I belonged, create like my own sort of like internal world, sort of. So I think in the book, in the book explicitly, I think they could sort of like draw on the fact that the book exists and is something that I, an immigrant, someone who traditionally doesn't belong, sort of use to kind of like make a space for myself. And through that like space making, I've been lucky enough to have kind of like have like a bit of a community for the first time. So I think just sort of Um, I think all of us can be like examples to younger people or examples to those on the margins of like, oh, there is another way of being. There is another way of existing in this society. Oh, you are able to carve out a niche or a space for yourself. So I think that's what I'm thinking of as the takeaway.
And Lindsay?
I think the one point I hope folks can glean from my collection is that question of history. In particular, sort of, I feel like given where we are now as a society in the global north context, that sort of hyper individualistic, like uber consumerist culture, like we become wrapped up in this idea of the individual to the point where we forget that there are people who have lived before us. There are people who have expressed lives in very sort of diverse ways prior to ours. And this collection, thinking about queer Caribbean people's place, their sort of role when it comes to that question of belonging, sort of asks us to return to that question of history and to recognize that there are people before the individuals in this collection who make up a long genealogy of lives of people who have expressed queerness in their own beautiful and diverse ways. And so that question of belonging for me is one that sort of asks you to remember that you are not the only one and that you have belonged, even if you are unaware of the ways in which you have belonged. There are histories, there are genealogies that you can turn to. You just have to do that work of, if you can, pondering, remembering, looking back to.
Thank you for that. And Jules?
Well, to go back to, Kafka, what Kafka had, said that, someone accused him of being, very negative. And he said, the very act of writing about, the darkness is an act of defiance because it says that I have survived this. And that is, you're not just saying I have survived, but my ancestors have survived. And that is what, what I hope that people take away. I have survived this and my ancestors have survived this and we are still standing, as Tecumseh said, here I stand. We have survived, we stand here.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. That was a very engaging discussion. And we want to thank all of you that took time to join us. And remember, books are available online and in person at Biblioasis, which is located at 1520 Wyandotte Street East, Windsor, Ontario. And the link is actually in the chat. It'll be a very worthy holiday gift if you get all three